Have you ever sat in a room so quiet that you could hear the sound of someone else's heartbeat accelerating into a full-blown panic? It is a fascinating sound. Most people spend their lives avoiding confrontation, fearing the awkwardness or the anger that comes with it. But for me, this moment, this specific, suffocating silence in this sterile conference room is not a moment of fear. It is a moment of perfect clarity. Across the table from me sit the two people who were supposed to be the closest to me, my daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Mike. They are currently sweating. It is a cold, nervous sweat that starts at the temples and beads up on the upper lip. Mike is trying to look tough, shifting in his leather chair, trying to find a comfortable position, but there is no comfort to be found here. His knuckles are white as he grips the edge of the table. Sarah, on the other hand, is avoiding eye contact entirely. She is staring at the thick, navy blue, leather-bound file sitting in the center of the table. She knows what is inside it. She knows that every single page inside that folder is a nail in their coffin. They came here today expecting an old, confused man who would crumble under pressure. They expected me to beg, to plead, or perhaps to simply give up. They didn't expect the man sitting across from them to be the same person who spent 3 decades dismantling the lives of people exactly like them. Most people look at me and see nothing more than a retired man with gray hair and a calm demeanor. They see a target. They see an opportunity to take what they didn't earn, assuming that my age is synonymous with weakness, and that my silence is a sign of fading cognitive ability. It is the greatest mistake they could have made. They thought that by locking me in that basement, they were trapping a victim. They didn't realize that they were actually locking themselves into a situation they had no hope of controlling. They treated my retirement fund like an open vault, unguarded and ripe for the taking. They didn't realize that I didn't just spend my career counting money. I spent my career hunting the people who thought they were smarter than the system. I spent 30 years as a senior forensic accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. While other people spent their lives building businesses or raising families, I spent mine dissecting the lies that people tell themselves about money. My world was defined by ledgers, bank statements, shell companies, and the delicate art of the paper trail. In my line of work, you learn a very specific truth. People are sloppy. They believe that they can hide their intentions behind complex financial structures or digital footprints, but they always leave a trace. Everyone leaves a trace. It is just a matter of knowing where to look and how to connect the dots. I wasn't the kind of agent who sat in a cubicle pushing papers. I was the one who was called in when the big cases went sideways. I was the one who walked into the boardrooms of multi-million-dollar corporations and watched the faces of CEOs go pale when I set a file on their desk, just like the one currently sitting in front of Mike and Sarah. I thrived on the analytical challenge of it. I viewed the world as a massive, intricate spreadsheet where every action had a corresponding reaction. Greed is a predictable emotion, and because it is predictable, it is easy to track. I spent decades taking apart Ponzi schemes, exposing money laundering operations, and watching arrogant men lose their entire empires because they thought they could outsmart a simple, methodical audit. They never realized that the most dangerous weapon in a negotiation isn't a loud voice or a threat. It is silence, backed by irrefutable facts. Over the years, I developed a reputation for being the man who never missed a detail. I was the person who noticed the one signature that was slightly off on a wire transfer request, or the single line item that didn't match the tax documentation from the previous year. I didn't get angry when I caught people stealing. I didn't raise my voice. I simply observed, documented, and waited for the right moment to close the trap. My job required a level of patience that most people simply don't possess. I could wait months, sometimes years, for the evidence to accumulate into an insurmountable mountain. I treated my professional life like a game of chess, and every case was a match I intended to win. I enjoyed the process of the hunt, the subtle gathering of information, the methodical building of a case, and the final, clinical dismantling of someone's arrogance. I saw how money could turn friends into enemies, siblings into rivals, and children into strangers. I saw it all from the safety of my office, detached and objective. I never imagined that one day I would have to apply these same skills to my own flesh and blood. I never thought that the lessons I taught about greed and deceit would be tested in my own home, in the basement where I was left to rot. But that is the irony of life. We spend our careers preparing for worst-case scenarios, thinking they happen to other people, until the moment they happen to us. Mike and Sarah thought they were playing a game with an easy target. They assumed I was an old man who didn't understand how the modern world worked. They thought they could manipulate me, move my money, and leave me with nothing while I was too distracted to notice. They were wrong. They forgot that I am the one who wrote the book on how to spot the fraud they were committing. They didn't realize that while they were busy plotting my downfall, I was already 3 steps ahead, quietly gathering every piece of evidence they were foolish enough to leave behind. They built a cage, but they are the ones who are trapped inside it. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. People like Mike and Sarah don't launch their schemes with a sudden blow. They use the boiling frog method. They raise the temperature slowly, imperceptibly, so that by the time you realize you are being cooked, it is already too late to jump out. It began about 6 months ago, shortly after they moved into the guest house. At first, it was just help. Sarah would stop by to check on my health, and Mike would offer to handle the tedious parts of home maintenance. It seemed innocent enough. They were a young couple trying to be attentive, or so I allowed myself to believe. But behind the polite smiles and the Sunday dinners, I could see the subtle shift in the dynamic. They weren't looking at me like a father and a grandfather. They were looking at me like a problem that needed a solution. Mike was the architect of the plan. He was a salesman by trade, a man who built his entire life on the foundation of superficial charm. He understood how to talk to people, how to make them feel comfortable, and more importantly, how to make them feel dependent. He started by suggesting that my retirement finances were outdated. He sat in my study, surrounded by my books and files, and told me how inefficient my paper-based record-keeping was. He spoke about the ease of digital banking, the security of cloud-based storage, and the peace of mind that came with having everything automated. He was persistent. Every time I mentioned my bank statements or my investment portfolios, he had an answer ready. "Why are you doing it the hard way, Pop?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Let me take that off your plate. You should be enjoying your time, not worrying about interest rates and tax forms." I played the role of the aging, slightly confused man perfectly. I nodded, I sighed, and I let him believe that he was winning. I let him help me set up a new online banking portal, watching him type away at my laptop with an eager, glinting hunger in his eyes. What he didn't know was that I was recording every keystroke. I didn't need to be an expert in technology to keep my own house in order. I just needed to be a step ahead. Every time he suggested a necessary update to my accounts, I would make a note of the date, the time, and the specific request. I documented every conversation, every suggestion, and every pressure tactic he used. It was all part of the audit trail. The real trouble started with the missing mail. I noticed it first on a Tuesday. A dividend statement from one of my primary accounts was missing. Then, an insurance renewal notice failed to show up. When I asked Sarah about it, she gave me that practiced, worried look, the one she had been working on for weeks. "Oh, Pop, you know how the mail delivery is around here. Maybe you misplaced it? Maybe you're forgetting to check the box regularly?" She was trying to plant the seed of doubt. She wanted me to believe that my memory was slipping, that I was becoming unreliable. It is a common tactic, and it is as predictable as it is cruel. By questioning my reality, they hoped to break my confidence so I would be more likely to sign whatever document they put in front of me. The power of attorney document was the centerpiece of their plan. It appeared on my desk on a rainy Thursday evening. Mike laid it out with a flourish, explaining that it was just a routine measure to ensure that Sarah could handle my medical bills and property taxes if I ever became incapacitated. He had that same look of forced sincerity on his face. He even brought a notary, a friend of his, someone I'd never met, to make it look official. He told me it was for my own protection. He said that if I ever had a fall or a health scare, they wouldn't be able to step in and save me without the legal authority to act on my behalf. It was a lie, of course, a transparent, desperate lie. I took the document and looked at it for a long time. I studied the language, the boilerplate clauses, and the excessive scope of the powers they were asking for. It wasn't just for medical emergencies. It was a blanket authorization to manage my assets, liquidate my accounts, and even sell my home. I didn't get angry. I didn't shout. I simply set the paper down and told them I needed to review it in private. I told them I wanted to consult with my own lawyer, a man they didn't know and couldn't influence. The look on their faces was priceless. For a brief second, the mask slipped. Mike's jaw tightened, and Sarah's eyes narrowed into slits of pure frustration. They hadn't expected pushback. They had expected me to sign it like a lamb, being led to the slaughter. When I refused to sign, the atmosphere in the house changed overnight. The helpfulness stopped. The Sunday dinners were replaced by cold, calculated silence. I knew then that they had moved on to the next phase of their plan. They weren't going to ask anymore. They were going to take. I started noticing things around the house. The lock on the basement door was suddenly replaced with a heavy-duty deadbolt. My phone line would occasionally go dead for hours at a time. I saw Mike hovering near my study when he thought I was asleep. They were getting ready to isolate me, to strip away my connections to the outside world, and to force my hand. I watched it all happen from behind my own mask. I saw the way they whispered to each other in the kitchen, the way they checked their watches, the way they moved through my house with a sense of entitlement that only a thief possesses. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. They thought that by taking away my phone, my mail, and my freedom of movement, they were rendering me powerless. But they were wrong. They didn't realize that in my line of work, isolation is just another word for focus. They were so busy plotting my demise that they never once stopped to wonder if I had already anticipated their every move. They were playing with a man who had spent 30 years trapping people just like them, and they were about to find out that the basement wasn't my prison. It was my final line of defense. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was, for them, a victory. For me, it was the starting gun. They left me in the basement, likely expecting me to pound on the door, shout for help, or perhaps weep with despair. They wanted to break my spirit before they moved on to the final stage of their operation, the liquidation of my assets. They assumed that isolation would breed panic. They didn't understand that isolation is the natural habitat of a forensic accountant. In the silence, my mind didn't descend into fear. It sharpened into a tool. I didn't panic because I had prepared for this exact scenario months ago. When I first noticed the subtle shift in Mike's behavior, the way he looked at my retirement portfolio, the way he hovered around my bank statements, I knew exactly what path he was walking down. People who are driven by greed follow predictable patterns. They are lazy, arrogant, and impatient. They think they are the first people to ever try to defraud an older relative. They don't realize that their playbook is thin, repetitive, and incredibly easy to anticipate. Months before the door was locked, I had turned my home into a surveillance grid. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about data collection. I installed microscopic cameras inside common household items. A smoke detector, a picture frame on the mantelpiece, a wall clock. They were wireless, high definition, and most importantly, completely invisible to the untrained eye. They were motion activated and synced directly to an encrypted, off-site cloud server. While Mike and Sarah were upstairs, patting themselves on the back for their genius plan, they were essentially starring in a movie of their own downfall, with me as the director. From the quiet of the basement, I wasn't disconnected. I was more connected than I had ever been. I had a secondary encrypted laptop hidden in a storage trunk, connected to a dedicated high-speed cellular hotspot. With a few keystrokes, I could monitor the live feed of my living room and my study. I watched them in real time. I watched Mike sit at my desk, sweating through his shirt as he tried to guess my banking passwords. I watched him input the credentials I had left specifically for him to find. A decoy account with just enough money to look real, but not nearly enough to satisfy his greed. It was a digital trap, perfectly baited. While they were busy celebrating, I was busy working. My routine in the basement was simple. I would monitor the feeds, document every single action they took on my digital accounts, and keep a meticulous log of the timestamps. I wasn't just watching them. I was building a case that would hold up in any federal courtroom in the country. I was tracking the wire transfer requests, the attempts to access my pension fund, and the multiple times they tried to initiate a change of beneficiary on my life insurance policy. Each click of the mouse was a piece of evidence. Each failed password entry was a testament to their incompetence. But the most important part of my investigation wasn't the surveillance. It was the communication. I had a burner phone, a simple, prepaid device that had never been connected to my home network. I used it to reach out to my former contacts at the SEC and the Department of Justice. I didn't need to explain much. I sent a series of encrypted messages to a colleague I had mentored for years, a woman who now sat in a position of significant authority. I provided her with the account numbers they were targeting, the digital logs I had compiled, and the recordings of their conversations. I wasn't asking for help. I was handing over a roadmap to a conviction. I watched them on the screen, listening to them discuss their future. They were already spending money they hadn't even stolen yet. They talked about buying a luxury car, about taking a vacation, about moving out of my guest house and into a penthouse in the city. They were drunk on their own arrogance. They didn't notice the subtle errors they were making. They didn't see the paper trail they were creating, the IP addresses they were using, the forged electronic signatures that left a unique digital footprint, the sheer, undeniable evidence of intent to defraud. They were so busy counting the imaginary money that they didn't see the net closing in around them. The slow burn was vital. If I had moved too quickly, they might have stopped. They might have gotten scared and run. I needed them to go all the way. I needed them to commit the crimes, to execute the wire transfers, to sign the fraudulent documents. I needed them to leave enough evidence behind that there would be no possibility of a plea deal, no chance of a misunderstanding. I needed their downfall to be absolute. And as I sat there in the dark, bathed in the soft blue light of my laptop screen, I felt a strange sense of professional satisfaction. I wasn't just a victim, I was an auditor, and their life was about to be officially declared bankrupt. The day of the final signing arrived, just as I had planned. I had sent a message to Sarah, pretending to be broken, defeated, and ready to hand over everything. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie they were desperate to believe. They arrived at the office, not my home, but a neutral, sterile conference room I had rented for the occasion. They dressed for the part. Mike wore a suit that was too expensive for his budget, signaling his anticipation of the windfall. Sarah looked triumphant, her posture stiff with the pride of someone who thinks they have finally gotten away with something big. They sat across from me, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. I took my time. I poured a glass of water, took a slow sip, and watched them fidget. They were eager to get it over with, but I was in no hurry. I placed the thick, navy blue folder in the center of the table. It looked heavy, substantial, and dangerous. Mike reached for it, his hand trembling just slightly, but I placed my hand on top of the cover. "Not yet," I said. My voice was even, devoid of any anger or accusation. It was simply the tone of a man reporting facts. I watched the shift in their eyes. The impatience turned to a flicker of confusion, then, very slowly, to a creeping sense of unease. They had come for a signature, but the atmosphere in the room was not the atmosphere of a deal. It was the atmosphere of a deposition. I opened the file. The papers were neatly organized, tabbed, and highlighted. Each page was a precise, cold record of their betrayal. I didn't need to shout to make my point. I simply turned the first page toward Mike. "This," I began, pointing to a document, "is the wire transfer request for my pension fund, dated 3 weeks ago. You used a digital signature, Mike. Very convenient, except for the fact that the IP address matches the one in your home office." I turned to the next page. "And this is the forged letter you sent to my bank, claiming I was experiencing memory loss and needed to transfer management of my assets to Sarah. It's a very persuasive letter, almost convincing, if not for the fact that I have the original recording of the conversation you had with the notary." I watched Mike's face lose its color. The arrogance that had defined his posture for the last 6 months evaporated, replaced by a raw, unadulterated fear. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deny it, perhaps to justify it, but no words came out. He looked at the documents as if they were ghosts. He realized, in that moment, that he hadn't just been stealing. He had been creating a permanent, indelible record of his own crimes. He had been so confident in his digital camouflage that he hadn't realized he was leaving footprints in fresh cement. Sarah was worse. She was staring at her hands, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She had been the one to comfort me, the one to look me in the eye and lie about wanting what was best for me. The weight of the deception was crashing down on her, and she had nowhere to hide. She looked at me, searching for the old, confused father she thought she had outsmarted. But she couldn't find him. She found only the professional, the man who had spent his life staring into the darkness of corporate greed and didn't blink. I kept going. I didn't rush. I laid out the logs of the attempted unauthorized withdrawals, the false invoices they had created, and the transcripts of the conversations I had captured from my home surveillance system. Each page was a new layer of the trap. I told them about the notifications I had set up with the authorities, how the fraud investigation was already underway, and how the evidence was currently sitting on the desk of an SEC official I had known for 20 years. The reversal was complete. The hunter had become the hunted. They had come here to strip me of my retirement, and instead, they had stripped themselves of their future. The silence in the room was absolute now, but it wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore. It was the crushing weight of reality. They were trapped, not by a basement door, but by the irrefutable, unchangeable facts of their own greed. The end of our meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no shouts, no tears, and no pleas for mercy. The silence in the conference room was eventually broken by a soft knock on the door, a knock that sounded like a death knell for the fantasy Mike and Sarah had constructed. When the door opened, it wasn't a squad of heavily armed officers bursting in. It was 2 plainclothes investigators, people I had spoken to days prior, They didn't need to say much. They had the warrants, they had the evidence, and they had the patience to let me finish what I started. Watching them place Mike in handcuffs was almost clinical. He didn't fight. He just stared at the floor, his entire reality crumbling as the realization settled in. He wasn't going to be a wealthy man living in a penthouse. He was going to be a convicted felon with a public record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sarah's breakdown was quieter, but it was just as absolute. She looked at me one last time, searching for some sign of the father who had raised her, the man who would have done anything to protect her. But the man she was looking for wasn't there. She had traded that relationship for a chance at a retirement fund that was never hers to take. As the officers led them away, the room felt suddenly intensely spacious. All the tension that had filled the air for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a sterile, quiet space that felt entirely indifferent to the wreckage they were leaving behind. The legal fallout was swift and total. My evidence was bulletproof. When you spend 30 years in forensic accounting, you learn that the most dangerous evidence is the kind that you don't have to explain. I had the digital logs, the surveillance, the forged signatures, and the paper trail of every attempted wire transfer. Their lawyers tried to negotiate, tried to claim misunderstanding or family confusion, but the documents told a different story. They were looking at charges of elder abuse, wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. Their assets were frozen, their credit was ruined, and their reputations, those precious masks they wore for society, were shredded. Sarah lost her job, and Mike's history of business successes was quickly exposed as a string of shallow, desperate schemes. They were ostracized by the rest of the family, not because I told them what happened, but because the truth eventually becomes impossible to hide. I returned to my home the next day. It was quiet, the kind of quiet I had missed for months. The basement door was wide open, a symbol of the freedom I had maintained all along. I walked through the house, turning off the cameras, removing the microphones, and deleting the off-site server backups. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I felt a strange sense of closure. I hadn't enjoyed destroying them, but I had enjoyed the efficiency of the justice system. They had made the mistake of assuming that my life was a passive object to be claimed, rather than an active system that could defend itself. People often ask me if I feel guilty. They wonder if a father should have forgiven his daughter, or if a grandfather should have been more lenient. But forgiveness requires a foundation of honesty, and there was never a moment of honesty in their plan. Greed is a corrosive element. It eats away at the structures of love and trust until there is nothing left but hollow shells. They didn't just try to steal my money. They tried to steal my dignity and my future. They bet on the idea that I was weak, and they lost. In the end, they were simply victims of their own lack of imagination. They could not conceive of a person who values integrity over comfort, or a person who spends their life preparing for the moment when someone tries to take what is not theirs. Life, I've learned, is a series of audits. Every action is recorded, and eventually, the ledger has to balance. You can try to cheat the numbers, you can try to forge the entries, and you can try to hide the discrepancy, but the math always catches up to you. My lesson to anyone who thinks they can outsmart the system or the people they believe are easy targets is simple. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never confuse silence for surrender, and never mistake patience for weakness. People like me are not the ones who make noise. We are the ones who observe, document, and wait. And when the time comes to balance the books, we don't hold back. I am back to my life now. The house is peaceful, the accounts are secure, and I can finally enjoy the retirement I worked so hard to build. The only difference is that now, I sleep with a different kind of peace, the peace that comes from knowing that the audit is complete, and the balance is exactly where it belongs.